As free agency starts to wind down, or at least slow down a little bit here, teams are still finishing filling all the different holes on their roster. The Chicago Bears still have some real work to do here, and not a lot of salary cap space left to do it.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully every day. On the show today, we look at where the Chicago Bears stand right now with, a decent amount of salary cap space, but relative to the number of holes they still have to fill, it kind of dries up quickly when you start to plug in different spots at the roster you'd like to still add potential free agents. So we'll kind of look at where the Bears sit financially, what they have to then still save for the NFL draft and the rest of the offseason, and kind of how their roster stands right now of where they could still use a couple other free agents to plug certain holes here and there, and why it's probably going to end up being more of bargain bin shopping than any kind of major names left out there. We'll go through some of the potential veteran minimum type players, or at least very cheap type players at some of those positions of need that we can be a little bit more excited about, that we can at least feel like we've heard of, and maybe closer to household names that could still come potentially cheap. And we'll also look at maybe a couple of ways the Bears could still find a little bit more cap room from the guys restructuring, releasing, trading on their own roster to maybe clear up a little bit more room if, say, a player became available via trade, or if there was one particular free agent they wanted to spend a little bit more money on. But as of right now, the Chicago Bears have about $16 million in salary cap space. And that ranks them, I believe, 11th in the NFL among all teams in terms of current salary cap space. And of course, this is kind of changing rapidly. So as you listen to this podcast, if a team signs another player, and not all the contract numbers have fully come in. So it's a little bit fluid at this stage in terms of specifically where the teams rank at this point. But we do have contract data now on Dane Cruikshank, the new Bears safety. And so the Bears right now sitting at just over $16 million at 11th ranking in the salary cap space. The Panthers have the most at 30, which is a little less than double the Bears. Then it comes down quite a bit to the Colts at 22, the Texans at 22, Browns at 21. So no one is rolling in the dough, but some teams have significantly more. And then, some teams are down less than $5 million toward the bottom of the list. But the Bears are kind of in this range with a lot of teams in the middle of the pack. Anywhere from 10 to 20 million in cap space right now seems to be where most teams fall. And that's not nothing, right? That's relatively speaking, a decent amount of salary cap space. But a team like the Bears and other teams are finding themselves in similar scenarios, still have significant spots to fill. And not just one or two, but more 9 or 10. And when you start doing the math there, if you have $16 million in cap space and maybe 9 or 10 spots you want to fill there, all of a sudden, it's not a lot of money to go around, right? I'm no math major here, but that's, less than $2 million in salary cap space per potential player. Plus, you also then have to leave some money unspent to sign your draft picks. The Bears don't have a first-round pick this year, of course, which actually means they will have to spend less on the rookies, because the later you go, of course, the lower their contracts are. And so they don't need to save as much money for the draft, but we're still looking at, $2.5-3 million plus when it comes to undrafted free agents in there. Plus you need to hold on to some emergency money in case, there's other free agents you need to sign for injuries later in the season, or certainly if a trade or something, or some of the incentives you have to have some extra money for in case those cash in later. You do need cap space for those. And so, that can take as much as at $5 million off of your really like spending money from your cap space. And when I look at this Bears roster right now, I see a couple positions that like feel like you must fill these or else you will be like negligent in your team building and drastically hurt your ability to succeed this season. And then there's a few positions that are like, you really should add more at those spots. But if you don't, I mean, you can maybe survive, but it's just not going to be ideal. And then there's a couple other spots where it'd be like, yeah, it'd be nice to add another player to here, but you don't need to, and you'd be fine without them. Like, I think right now you must add an offensive lineman, particularly like a right guard, because Dakota Dozier is penciled into your starting spot right there, and he is not a starting caliber offensive lineman. Right now you have 4 starting caliber offensive linemen under contract on your team, and it just feels like you cannot go into this season without signing some sort of offensive lineman. You're going to need something in there. I think you also have to sign a punter at this point. It's not going to be a break the bank type signing, but like Pat O'Donnell signed with the Packers. You have Ryan Winslow, who's much more of like a camp leg, but not like a real reliable punter. You're going to need to do something at punter. And kind of a sneaky one here, the Bears need to sign a backup tight end. Right now under contract, it's Cole Kmet and it's Jesper Horsted. You need another tight end, and that's not going to be an expensive position, but like it's just a matter of fact, one of those contracts is going to have to go to a backup tight end. Those are the 3 that I think you absolutely have to sign no matter what in order to avoid, just absolute disaster this season. I think they should sign another wide receiver, another cornerback, probably another safety, and another linebacker. Now, could you go into this season with Mooney, Pringle, St. Brown, and Daz Newsome as your top 4 wide receivers? You could, right? You're not going to be desolate at wide receiver, but you might be looking at one of the worst wide receiving cores in the NFL. Same kind of thing at cornerback, right? It's like you could go into this season again with Jalen Johnson, Kindle Vildor, Duke Shelley, and Thomas Graham. That is a choice you could make, but it would not be a great cornerback group, and you should, in theory, add another piece at cornerback. We talked yesterday about Dane Cruikshank coming in at safety, maybe competing with DeAndre Houston-Carson, but you should, in theory, add another safety, and same kind of thing at linebacker. I'd still also like to add a nose tackle, just more depth there, and probably at least one more offensive lineman for additional depth, but those are more like, would be nice, but you can get by with the guys you have. So like, between the musts and the should, that's 7 spots right there that like either must be signed or really should be signed. And $16 million minus maybe 5 for draft picks and emergency money, $11 million for 7 spots there is, $1.5 million a pop. And that's not a lot of money to sign any kind of big free agents. But we'll go through, okay, can they do some more bargain bin shopping and still get some good value at those spots? Absolutely. We'll look at receivers, offensive linemen, and defensive backs that could come cheap and could still provide some pretty good options for the Bears next on Locked On Bears. After months of college basketball, the big tournament this month is down to its top teams, the last 4, and the national champions are coming just this weekend. Lay some money down, have some extra fun with these March games. I guess they're going to be April games this weekend, with our friends at BetOnline, the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. BetOnline.net has the latest odds, contests, and player props. You name it, BetOnline is the place to make your college basketball tournament that much more fun. It's the best spot regardless of league, regardless of season, for all the developments, the reviews, the news you need to know for college basketball, NBA playoffs right around the corner, hockey playoffs right around the corner, baseball season just about to get started, plus soccer, tennis, golf, boxing, UFC, live betting, even your favorite Vegas casino games online, all of it through our friends at betonline.net. Head over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. When I start looking around at Chicago Bears free agents that they can afford for either, veteran minimum or close to it, it's not pretty, right? But you can find some names, and the hard part here, right, is knowing who's worth what, who might be willing to take closer to veteran minimum, and who might command a bigger contract. And that's sort of, I think, the mode the Bears are in right now, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But so I guess some of these come with caveats to say where it's like, well, maybe you could get them for veteran minimum, but they might be more inclined to play on a veteran minimum contract for a team more seriously pushing for the Super Bowl this year as opposed to being a potential long-term option. But if some of these free agents look around and kind of see a lot of their options drying up, and maybe the Bears will go slightly above minimum for them, or even, $1 million or $2 million for them. Because, like, for example, you're not going to sign a punter at this point to a massive contract. They'll be a minimum deal. So they'll be less than $1 million, presumably. I mean, it depends on who they sign, or backup tight end. It's going to be less than $1 million type veteran minimum contract. So if you sign the backup tight end for less than $1 million, then if you're allocating money, right, that frees up a little bit more to invest in, say, a wide receiver, right? I mean, I look at like John Ross, the former Bengals first-round pick, spent this past season with the Giants. If you're looking for upside there, that he's not a starter at this stage in his career, but speed, size. I mean, there's a reason he was a top pick, for the Bengals, just never really quite panned out. Take a flyer on him and feel like, okay, maybe you can squeeze something and add one more body into this wide receiver room. If you start to dial up the money a little bit, I wonder what Keelan Cole is going to cost. The Jets wide receiver spent a lot of time with the Jaguars early in his career. He's been productive, not a number one type, but a fairly productive wide receiver. I think it's going to take more than a minimum contract to get him, but how much more could he be affordable in that range? Or another potential cheap wide receiver, because he hasn't played either of the past 2 seasons, injured in 2021, IR the whole season, opted out of 2020. But 2019 and before, Allen Hurns was a pretty solid receiver for the Jaguars. Again, limitations there. We're keeping our expectations low, but for a guy who hasn't played, take a flyer on him and see if he can get healthy and get back to something that could play better than the contract that you offer him. The other veteran name I'm curious about that, again, I don't know that Chicago is the most realistic option for him, but Sammy Watkins, just given the Ryan Poles connection to Kansas City, spent last season with the Ravens and really just isn't quite the Sammy Watkins he was early in his career, or the Sammy Watkins we thought he could still be, but familiarity, size, speed add to this receiving core. I'm not sure Chicago is the fit he's exactly looking for, probably more of a contender, but never ruled out with that familiarity with Ryan Poles. Offensive line spots, we talked about a few of these guys. Was it last week on the podcast where we talked about the Bears' approach to the offensive line so far and how it's felt like they haven't put enough of a priority on that spot? I don't know what Darrell Williams from Buffalo is looking for financially. He's been their starter at guard and tackle. I think that would be an ideal type of versatility for what the Chicago Bears are looking for, even if he's not quite, as mobile of a scheme fit as you might be looking for. Same kind of thing with Trey Turner from the Pittsburgh Steelers. We talked about him a little bit. The Bears offensive line coach, Chris Morgan, was the assistant offensive line coach for the Steelers last season, coaching Trey Turner. Spent a lot of his career with the Panthers, I think, before that. Starting caliber right guard, but is he looking for more money than that? And are the Bears just kind of waiting that out? Also mentioned another Chiefs connection, Laurent Duvernay-Tardif, the medical doctor who opted out during the pandemic to go help be like a doctor and treat COVID-19 patients. Played last season with the Jets. Average starting caliber guard, veteran should be on the cheap there. And then another name with familiarity that we haven't talked about yet, Lane Taylor. Spent last season with the Texans, did not play particularly well, but a lot of time before that in Green Bay was kind of their backup swing guard there. I think he might have even played a little bit of tackle. Teammates of Lucas Patrick. Familiarity with Luke Getsy and what the offensive scheme they would be bringing. Not a guy you get super, super excited about, but I would absolutely take him over Dakota Dozier and what the Bears also still have at guard right now with what's been left. The other big name that's kind of worth keeping an eye on, I guess, is Michael Schofield from the Los Angeles Chargers. Another one of these sort of good, has started at guard, has started at tackle before in his career. Quality offensive lineman, and if the price is right, absolutely, he would be a big upgrade for what the Chicago Bears would be looking at the offensive line. It just seems like the likes of maybe like a Duvernay-Tardif or Lane Taylor are going to be even on the even more cheaper side, and that ultimately may be where the Bears are a little bit hamstrung to partake in, given their cap space and the needs that they have to fill. Cornerback still has a few names out there, some veterans, and I wanted to point to specifically 3 of them with familiarity, right? Especially if you're trying to get a guy to come cheap, I would assume a player who knows the coaching staff and the regime would be more likely to maybe take a lesser contract and to go cheaper to go play with a coach he knows that he feels like can put him in the best position to be successful compared to like some other random outside free agent who might just be taking a chance on joining your team and having a good season there. I've been bringing it up all offseason as like, not that I'm advocating for it, it's just more like it seems like it makes a lot of sense and I'm expecting something along. I'm surprised we haven't heard more about this, just connecting the dots of Xavier Rhodes from the Indianapolis Colts, of course, played with Matt Eberflus. Eberflus was reportedly or rumored to be kind of a really big fan of Xavier Rhodes. He spent a lot of time with the Vikings before that earlier in his career. Still sitting out there as a veteran free agent. Could see him stepping in and being sort of the veteran short-term option to pair with Jalen Johnson while you work to develop the likes of Thomas Graham and some of the other younger players behind him. Not the only current/former Matt Eberflus Colt, though, up for grabs here. You can also look at a TJ Carey from the Colts. He was kind of a off-the-bench spot starter for them a little bit the last couple of seasons. Not like the guy they necessarily went to all the time, but was reliable and can also play some good special teams for them. And also Pierre Desir. He was with the Buccaneers this past season, but had been with Eberflus's Colts in the couple of years prior to that. He was a first-round pick by the Browns a while ago and was a little bit of a bust, maybe a little bit overdrafted, but kind of found a little bit of rejuvenation in Indianapolis. Right? None of them are going to come in and play at Pro Bowl levels this season or anything like that, but we're talking cheaper, more value. Familiarity with the scheme makes the transition a little bit easier, and then you can get younger players developing behind them. Those all seem like natural fits, and I'm surprised, A, one of them hasn't been signed already, or B, there hasn't been more smoke, rumors, speculation, reporting on mutual interest in there. Real quickly, at safety, I wonder if, as the market kind of plays out and the salary cap space dries up, if you could just bring back Tashawn Gibson. He played on veteran minimum contracts the last 2 seasons. Cheap, knows his teammates. I mean, he's not great. We don't love Tashawn Gibson, but like, you do worse. And you have Houston Carson and now Dane Cruikshank in there. If Gibson gets hurt or if he just plays really poorly, and you feel like you at least have options under contract right now that are younger that you could go to if you needed to, if Gibson didn't work out for some reason. Also, if we're playing the Colts familiarity game, Andrew Sendejo was the Colts starting safety last season and is currently available as a free agent. Another one of these former Minnesota Vikings that made the transition to the Colts with Eberflus. It was just kind of a 1-year thing, but knows the system already. Veteran leadership can kind of come in and not going to be your long-term answer at safety. I think he might even be older than Gibson. I think he's like 34. But again, fill a need, get a veteran who you can afford, who can play maybe better than the unproven guys you currently have at the position. I'm intrigued by P.J. Williams from the Saints as a versatile guy who can play the slot, can play the box, can play the deep corner, play the deep safety spot as well. But he might be a little bit on the more expensive side. But I like his versatility as a name that would be fun to be able to pair with Eddie Jackson. So not all those guys are going to be as affordable as the Bears want them to be, and not all those guys are sexy household names that make you feel great. But it's better than guys you've never heard of. And it can be better than some of the other options currently on the team that fit within the Bears' salary cap parameters. Now, they do have some, and emphasis on some, flexibility to create more salary cap space. The salary cap is real, despite what some people want you to believe, but it's just about being creative in how you're going to sort of manage that. But we'll kind of go through what the Bears can do and what would be smart and less smart for creating more salary cap space next on Locked On Bears. Right before started recording Locked On Bears, I had a delicious brownie batter Built Bar, and it's actually a Built Puff, one of the other Built Bar products by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars. And it really does taste like chocolate fudge, kind of like brownie deliciousness. It's sweet and it's tasty, and it's somehow also good for you. Every Built Bar is low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. And yet it's soft, it's easy to chew, it's covered in 100% real chocolate, and it tastes like a candy bar without any of that guilt or any of that extra sugar and crap that just makes you not feel good after you get that blood sugar rush and blood sugar spike and then crash back down. I'm telling you, you got to try Built Bars for yourself. You'll believe it when you taste it. Head on over to Built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. the Chicago Bears can shave, I don't know if it's 15%, not quite, but can shave a little bit off of their salary cap situation. Not a lot, but enough to where they could make enough space to make one more decent size move. But the more space you try and make, the more trouble you're playing with, right? The more dangerous you're potentially getting in here in terms of future lack of financial flexibility. And it's why it would seem like a lot of the potential salary cap saving moves seem unlikely because, the Bears traded Khalil Mack and have made some of their other decisions in part to free up future salary cap space and salary cap flexibility. And so, for example, the option that could create the most cap space for the Bears right now would be to restructure Robert Quinn's contract and take some of the money you owe him now and push that into the future and take some of your future salary cap space and make that available now. It's what we've seen Ryan Pace and company do in the previous regime because they were trying so much to win right now. And so, of course, pay for it later, get the players now, try and win and save our jobs didn't actually work all that well. And plus with Robert Quinn, right, part of the nice thing about the way his deal is structured right now is that after this season, they can get out of it very easily by cutting him, or trading him, I suppose, and saving a lot of that salary cap space. And after the season, there's not a lot, relatively speaking, of guaranteed money still owed on his contract. And so you don't have to stick with Robert Quinn for the long term. When you restructure it, you push more of that guaranteed money into the future, and you essentially make it less easy to get out of that contract in the future and would kind of lock yourself into additional years of Robert Quinn beyond what you were maybe initially planning on keeping him for. And that's why it wouldn't seem all that likely that you would restructure a contract for a player that might not be a huge part of your long-term plans. You could also do the same thing with Eddie Jackson's contract. But do you want to lock yourself into more years of Eddie Jackson at this high salary price point, given some of the struggles he's had in recent seasons? Because, he's kind of been getting this fresh slate is one of the things we've talked about with him with this new regime, that it's an opportunity to sort of reprove himself a little bit and be, they know what he's capable of, but now to show it again and say all that stuff in the past is in the past. Whatever you do this year will determine kind of what they want to do with him moving forward. So I'm not sure they're going to be eager to lock themselves into more years of Eddie Jackson without seeing more of Eddie Jackson first this season. The one that seems like the most likely, if they were going to restructure someone, would be Cody Whitehair. It's kind of the last of the three restructures. They could save, I think, a little over $5 million by converting his current salary into future roster bonus money. And with him, yes, you would increase his salary cap hits over the next couple of seasons, but presumably you do want Cody Whitehair to be here for the next couple of seasons and be a little bit more of a longer term type piece for this offensive line. So it's a little bit easier to stomach potentially restructuring him to create that $5 million because you'll want him here either way, and it's still the same money that you get to pay him, either just pay him in the future or pay him right now. Otherwise, those are kind of the big easy clearing spots. I believe you could also clear some salary cap space if you gave Roquan Smith a contract extension and then brought down the first year salary and bumped up the future year salaries. Again, taking away some of that future financial flexibility, but would create it right now. And if you're going to extend Roquan Smith anyway, you might as well clear up some space right now. If you're going to pay him, what's the difference if you're going to pay him, I don't know, $18 million next year versus $20 or $22 million next year? How much of a big difference does that make in the grand scheme of things? Some, but would you rather have that salary cap space now versus then? That's another way to create some space, but a little bit less instant and take some negotiation in there. You can't just decide tomorrow, okay, we're going to restructure or extend Roquan and give him this contract and make it all happen. But it's a possibility. We also look to the Nick Foles trade. If and when they're able to find a trade partner, that should save $3 million right off of the bat. If they trade him, I think it saves $4 million. If they were to cut him, it would save $3 million, I believe, based on where the money is guaranteed in his contract. So there's some differences there. Hopefully the trade partner would take on an additional $1 million of that guaranteed because it's his base salary that's guaranteed during the season. It's kind of one of those weird salary cap kind of intricacies there, but there's some space to be cleared when Nick Foles is eventually traded or released. And then another little tiny one, Jeremiah Atauchu. We kind of talked about him as Is he going to play defensive end in this defense? He's always been a 3-4 outside linebacker and a little bit small, but you could cut him and save $1.5 million. You could trade him and save just under $2 million. It's not a huge difference, but a couple $1 million here and there can be a difference maker if you're really tight on salary cap space. So that's about it, right? There's not a lot of options that feel really good and really smart, and it just doesn't seem like the Bears are in that position right now to make those salary cap adjusting moves because they're trying to create the future flexibility. So instead, I think we're in this stage right now where the Bears are waiting it out, and they're going to try and see, okay, some of these free agents want to see how much money they can get. And the Bears might be sitting here saying, listen, we can't afford to pay you a ton, and if you can go find better money somewhere else, best of luck to you. But if your market dries up a little bit, come back to us, and we want you at this price point. And I think that's kind of where the Bears find themselves and why it's been a little bit slow in kind of finding which players they're going to sign. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. It's a patience game. It's trying to sort of see who ends up being left and who is willing to then sort of come to you and say, all right, I'm willing to take the cheap deal, and where can they find the good value, because there's just too many holes to fill and not enough salary cap space to fill it. Whatever the Bears end up doing, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day, and I hope that every day the Locked On Bears podcast makes it a little bit easier for you to bear down.